So our last plenary of the symposium. Again, three presenters. We have Rick Bass, who many know. He's a local author, and he's going to be representing the Three Rivers Challenge. Jennifer Ferenstein, who works for the Wilderness Society and is going to talk about the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act, and Shane Jimmerfield, who works for the Siskiyou Project, who's going to be talking about the Wild Rivers Master Stewardship Agreement. So, Rick, take it away.
Can you all hear me all right in the back? The Three Rivers Challenge, essentially the genesis of it was 46 years ago when the Wilderness Act of 1964 passed and didn't protect any wilderness lands in the Yak Valley, which I call any land north of the Kootenai River. It's the lowest elevation land in the state, the most biologically diverse, and in my view, the wildest because of that biological diversity. Wilderness is really at the heart of the Three Rivers Challenge. There are a lot of components to the proposal, but it is wilderness generated. Congress failed to protect any wilderness in the Yak. The local government failed to protect any wilderness. Environmentalists have failed to protect wilderness up there. So this local grassroots group that I'm a member of, the Yak Valley Forest Council, just kept going to people in the community saying, we want and need wilderness. How can we get that? Why won't you support it? It's not going to hurt you. And there was this incredibly toxic, abusive cultural standoff where wilderness, even though people had never seen wilderness, they didn't even know what it was in northwest Montana, were terrified of it, thought that it was going to be the death of a logging culture, the death of freedoms, the death of a lot of stuff. And gradually, through our outreach, we began to, our group was simultaneously doing a lot of proactive restoration work up in the Yak. We had to convince environmentalists that wilderness in the Yak was even a worthy goal, because I'd come down here to Missoula sometimes 20 years ago, and people would say, oh, the Yak, it's not wild. It's got 10,000, there are 10,000 miles of logging road on the Kootenai. That's why there's no wilderness up there. And that may be what it's like on the map, but that's not what it's like on the ground. So, again, what has brought this proposal forward is just a need for wilderness. Gradually from that, we've pulled in other supporters. A dwindling timber industry. I joke, our executive director, Robin King, she and I used to go to these dying mills and say, hey, we've got a lot of overstock on the Kootenai. It used to be 50% old growth, and now 2/3 of the forest is 17-inch DBH or less. You just can't support that much biomass on an acre of ground up there. And that was before global warming. So where can we do some thinning? How can we help your mill? And every time we'd go to one of these mills, they'd go out of business 6 months later. And so we joke that they started locking the doors when they saw us coming. It was like a plague. Here, we're here to help you. There is one independent mill left in Lincoln County, Chapel, Cedar, and Troy, and they're very interested in this small diameter fuels reduction thinning that's part of the proposal. The snowmobile lobby, for lack of a better word, has come in and joined our proposal, which was a very tense and hard relationship. They had become our primary adversaries as the timber culture and industry dwindled and died. We're fortunate in the Yak. There's not a lot of snowmobile habitat. There are just a few high basins up in the northwest corner where current legal use is allowed. And those folks were terrified. They're afraid they're going to lose everything. And we said, well, as long as the needs of winter wildlife are met, we can support your existing use up there in some of these basins, not all of them. And it was not easy, but they've agreed to come along. I think fear was motivating them. So skipping ahead here, this list of questions that's framing these presentations, this was really ground, grassroots up. We didn't involve the Forest Service at all in these discussions. The Forest Service had just not been a trustworthy player in these discussions historically. The Forest Service had gone 46 years without an acre of wilderness in the Yak. There were many things that kind of jump-started this, but the forest planning process comes along every 10, 15 years. And we had finally gotten some recommended wilderness in the forest plan on the Kootenai, which was actually being paired with the Idaho Panhandle. Sidebar, there are 900,000 acres of roadless lands, unprotected roadless lands in northwest Montana on the Kootenai and northern Idaho. So, this is a big issue that's not going away, and we need to come up with some pilots that will address what to do with those lands, how to protect them. We finally got a lot of wilderness protected in the forest plan on the Yak, and then a senator who's no longer in office came in and threatened the supervisor of the Kootenai, saying, if you don't take this wilderness out of the forest plan, if there's any wilderness at all in your forest plan, I'm going to cut off your funding for the Kootenai. And so that set us back. We lost all our wilderness, but that was when we said, okay, we're not even going to talk to the Forest Service about this. We're going to come up with a community proposal and then take it to the Forest Service and make their work easy for them, because they didn't have the stomach to do what needed to be done. So that's one of the generative forces here. For years before this, thank you. Wow, that's so awesome. Wow. We'd been going to our delegation, to the senators, to the representatives, and every time we'd go out there and talk to them, they'd say, you bring us a proposal that the community supports and we'll pass it. And so that's what, for years and years, we're just trying to get a proposal that the community would support. We chased after some of those TPL lands, those old Plum Creek and Champion lands, industrial timber lands that were for sale. We thought, okay, if we can purchase those and manage them as a community forest, that'll give some predictable, sustainable jobs, restoration jobs, and thinning to these mills. We kind of hit a dead end on that, but this generative process was in our mind all along, like, what do our enemies want? We know what we want. What do they want? What can we support? And there was a lot we couldn't support. So in a nutshell, the Three Rivers Challenge is a map of common ground of what we can all agree on without compromising our needs and beliefs. You may have noticed in looking at Senator Tester's bill, the Three Rivers Challenge is the smallest land mass treated, and that's, in my opinion, that's why, because our map of common ground is not, it's not real wide up there. We have some great depth in places, but there's still a lot of stuff that we don't agree on up there, so we said we're just not going to fight over the stuff that we're going to fight over. Where's the most obvious wilderness up there? Roderick Mountain. Nobody thinks Roderick should not be wilderness. That's growth from our outreach from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, that was not the case. Those basins up in Northwest Peaks where the current legal existing snowmobile use goes, I just assumed there were no snowmobiles anywhere, on the face of the earth, quite frankly. And I tell the snowmobile folks that, and and they don't like hearing it, but they do appreciate the honesty. I also know, there's no way we're going to get them out of those basins where they have their legal use unless they violate the Endangered Species Act, which they will be on task to not do that. That's part of this legislation. ATVs I am more disturbed by than even snowmobiles, but we've got a great local president of the ATV club, and he's just looking for some routes to ride in the front country. He doesn't want anything to do with roadless lands. He wants to be he's just a good middle-aged citizen who's tired of the fighting and wants to go out with his son, on some trails. So again, we're chasing some of these old TPL lands, these Stimson and Champion and Plum Creek lands, and thinking, where can we reconnect, recontour some of these old roads? And he's really in it, not so much for the ATV routes down there, but just to stop the community fighting. I don't know what other partners I'm leaving out. They'll probably come up in the questions and answers. In conclusion, why did we choose the path or strategy that we did of using a legislative proposal? Because we have a paid staff of one up there covering, essentially a million acres north of the Kootenai River, and we don't want to repeat this process on every project, every forest plan, every year for the next 46 years. Some of these areas, these most special areas, we want to be protected permanently, and wilderness is the gold standard for permanent protection. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. Thanks. So my name is Jennifer Ferenstein. I work with the Wilderness Society. I work on one campaign that we focus on here in the Northern Rockies, which is the Rocky Mountain Front portion of Montana. I sort of took the questions that Martin posed to us and mixed them together to make more of a narrative. So I'll try to cover all the topics that we were asked to cover, and then I also just want to give a little bit of a sense of collaboration and how it relates to the work of the coalition in sort of a philosophical sense as well. So the Coalition to Protect the Rocky Mountain Front really started almost 10 years ago. And at that time, it was formed with a mix of people, Blackfeet tribal members, ranchers, outfitters, conservation organizations, the Sierra Club, Alliance for the Wild Rockies, Wilderness Society, Defenders, National Wildlife Federation, Montana Wildlife Federation, all these organizations, Montana Wilderness Association, and a variety of others I haven't named, have all been involved in the coalition at one time or another. I think that there has been a natural ebb and flow in participation in the coalition, and like I said, it's a loose-knit coalition. It's not super formal. It has oftentimes held meetings. It's coalesced stronger when there's a threat. Then it's ebbed a little bit when we feel like we're on the right track and things are going smoothly up there. But it hasn't changed much in its composition in the last 10 years. There's still the same amount of diversity as there was when it started. Now, Rick threw down the gauntlet when he said that his might be the wildest country in Montana. I would say that second to none is the Rocky Mountain Front. It's, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's about 110-mile swath of land. The northern part is cradled between Glacier National Park and the Blackfeet Nation, and it goes south down to Rogers Pass. It encompasses 2 national forests, the Lewis and Clark and the Helena National Forests, and BLM land, which has been designated as outstanding natural areas for the front. It's bounded on the east by the Bob, the Scapegoat, the Great Bear, and it's bounded on the west by private lands, state lands, primarily large intact ranches. It covers a variety of ecotones. It goes from up into the Alpine Mountains of the Divide down prairie potholes, prairies, reefs, swamps, they call them, which are these incredible open prairie pothole and with rivers actually flowing underground and creating a very rich habitat that's home to grizzly bears, wolves, huge elk populations and the like. And it also has a unique history and having a real strong sense of community and place. In the context, in and of itself, there's a culture there, both the ranching culture and also as a cultural and historic and spiritual epicenter for the Blackfeet tribe, particularly in the northern part of the Rocky Mountain Front, which is called the Badger II Medicine portion of the Lewis and Clark National Forest. The threats to the area, which again has sort of been the reason that the coalition has coalesced, have been great and imminent, and I'm proud to say that we have risen to the challenge in a very grassroots fashion on previous threats. I'd say that the primary threats have been oil and gas development and off-road vehicle expansion over time on the front. This is a little bit unique about our proposal maybe than any others I've heard. There's really not a timber harvesting component and or threat. It's a low productivity area. It's harsh growing conditions. There's never been an established infrastructure for mills. Most of the use there has primarily been firewood gathering, post and pole, very small scale. So we don't have this issue or challenge of dealing with timber on the front. Again, it's been identified as the top 1% of wildlife habitat in the lower 48 states. And I just want to give you just a tiny bit of a context for past victories, because I think Martin and others have made an interesting statement about what brings people together, whether you want to call it a collaboration or a negotiation or a partnership or whatever you want to call it. For us, it has really been around threats. We've resolved the threats, and then actually we've come to the point where we have a status quo, an administrative status quo. And in essence, our proposal, embodied in a piece of legislation, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment, is to protect the hard-fought status quo that we have come to administratively and leap it over into the legislative arena. But let me just give you a little bit of context. So certain areas of the public lands of the front were leased for oil and gas development. During the Bush administration, there was an EIS initiated to go ahead and start drilling in the heart of the front, in the Blackleaf area of the front. Well, it was put on hold and basically canceled, that EIS process. And the reason was given to allow partners and people to come together to find a solution to protect the Rocky Mountain front. So we all rose to that challenge. We worked in a bipartisan fashion with, at that time, Senator Burns and Senator Baucus. We got legislation passed in 2006 that permanently withdrew the area from future oil and gas development and basically created an exit strategy for companies to get rid of their existing leases on the front, and then those areas would not be re-leased in the future. So we, even under the Bush administration, we stopped oil and gas development permanently on the Rocky Mountain front. Since then, we have successfully worked to retire the leases in the Blackleaf area. So now there's no threat of oil and gas development on federal public lands leasing program in the lower 2/3 of the front. And we've made great progress in the Badger 2 Medicine area of the front in getting rid of some existing leases. In 2009, after many years of working with and against the Forest Service, we were able to secure a very good travel plan for the public lands, the Forest Service public lands of the front. That basically put about 80% of the Forest Service public lands on the Lewis and Clark National Forest off limits to motorized use. And there was 2 decisions. The first one was for the lower 2/3 of the front, and the second one came out about a year later for the Badger 2 Medicine. The Badger 2 Medicine proposal, the ROD, Record of Decision, was for 100% non-motorized Badger 2. Neither one of those decisions have been challenged by conservationists. So our status quo on the front going forward was really getting rid of the oil and gas development and having a pretty clear slate to start with outside of the Badger 2, and then also having a very good travel plan as a starting point. And that really led us to an opportunity to build on that success. And that's what led us to work towards looking for a landscape level approach that would, we felt once and for all, working with our local partners, try to figure out how to protect the Rocky Mountain front, public lands of the Rocky Mountain front permanently. We used kind of what I would call a concentric model for organizing. We started locally, we started small, we started with people who had been members of the coalition locally, had been through the oil and gas fights, had been through the motorized use fights, were basically trial by fire. We talked with them about their vision of landscape protection for every acre of the public lands. We did not start by pulling a map out and trying to draw boundaries and trade-offs and haggling, but we also started out, I would say what characterizes the heritage proposal is not collaboration. We, at one point early on in our campaign, we came to a critical juncture where should we form official collaboration and work with a facilitator and do all this? Frankly, people on the front were just not into it. It's too bureaucratic, it would take too long. Let's just try to come up with an idea and see it through. They were also feeling pretty high after the oil and gas victory. I think they had what I'd characterize as a Superman complex. They thought if we can get oil and gas stopped on the front under the Bush administration with Senator Burns, a Republican, leading the charge, we can get wilderness on the front. We can get a proposal passed. So that was a great place to be. So we started locally. Then we started widening out. We went both to county commissioners, user groups like mountain bikers, ranchers, permittees, outfitters. We had a lot of small meetings and individual meetings. We oftentimes took the Forest Service with us to those meetings, which I think is important. We didn't partner with the Forest Service, but we're not the ones that are going to manage the public lands. We came up with the parameters for management, and then we let the Forest Service try to answer the questions about what it would mean on the ground, so that we tried to stay out of between the management decisions or the management promises that might be made in the future. Our proposal ended up being, because I know I've got 0 left, our proposal ended up being, you can see it on the website, so I don't want to belabor it, 86,000 acres of new wilderness added to the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, about 218,000 acres of conservation management area designation, which protects the roadless qualities of the lands and limits the expansion of motorized use, and then a larger planning area of over 400,000 acres to deal with what we think is the largest threat, which is noxious weeds, as an ecological and economic threat to the Rocky Mountain front. So I will wrap up there and just say, I don't think what we do is collaboration so much as I think that we have used traditional grassroots organizing techniques to bring an idea to the forefront. We don't have a sponsor for our proposal. We've posted multiple versions of the proposal on the web. We've held 4 public discussions, multiple presentations, and I think we're an example of democracy working, and I better get off the stage now. Thanks.
Hello, thank you. Shane Jimmerfield with Siskiyou Project, and I'm here to represent the Wild Rivers District Master Stewardship Agreement. We're based in the Siskiyou Mountains of Southwest Oregon in the Illinois Valley. It's the Wild Rivers District of the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. It's a very biologically diverse place. Botanicals are really the emphasis there. We have 27 conifers, over 1,000 different plants, over 100 endemics. There's probably 37 types of hippies, 42 types of rednecks, and I'm kind of a hybrid of the two. And one of the tools that we've used is what's called the Master Cost Share Stewardship Agreement. It's a 10-year, 10,000-acre agreement between Lomacatsi Restoration Project, Siskiyou Project, and the Wild Rivers District of the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. Lomacatsi Restoration Project is a community-based ecological restoration organization. They have over 10 years, probably closer to 15 years of on-the-ground community relationships implementing ecological restoration on private lands and public lands. Siskiyou Project is a 25-year-old community-based conservation group. We all know who the Forest Service is. Our place, Southwest Oregon, can be characterized as ground zero in the timber wars in the Northwest. And I think Lomacatsi would agree that we kind of view this part of our collaboration, this Master Stewardship Agreement, as a partnership between our two organizations and the Forest Service. But that partnership works in collaboration and is held kind of accountable to the community, the contractors, the workers, local electeds, the Small Diameter Collaborative, the Josephine County Stewardship Group, and other organizations in the area that we work collaboratively with. And so why? Why are we doing this? Is we're trying to build sustainability in our place in Southwest Oregon. And we believe basically that sustainability is a genuine balance of the social, ecological, and economic factors of the area. And to balance those, we're engaging in restoration. So what are we restoring? I think it goes beyond just the ecological, but also the social component, the community. As I mentioned, ground zero, a lot of polarization, a lot of entrenched views. We need to restore that. We need to bring the community back together, building bridges, healing the polarization, and other social factors like reducing the threat of fire are important in our area. The economic component, building local capacity to actually implement these projects on the ground, workforce training, niche market development and exploration for byproduct utilization. Those two components we believe are as important as the ecological component. And the ecological component, of course, is restoring degraded habitat. There's over 100,000 acres of plantations in the Illinois Valley. We're trying to focus most of our energy on those, roads and streams as well. And so that's kind of our vision that we want to see results on the ground that address these three things and create sustainability and healing in our place, in our community. And because we are place-based, we do believe in community collaboration, and we hold certain values related to that, and that being that, all levels of the process, from development to implementation to post-project monitoring, are all equally important to us and necessary. So kind of the take-home point that I want to talk about a little bit for us, and try to convey some of that to you, hopefully, is that implementation has to be, and is for us, a very important part of this process. And we look at that, by having a highly skilled, trained, local ecological workforce. Ecological restoration doesn't happen in meetings and in symposiums. It's a process that actually happens on the ground. That's where stewardship occurs. It occurs out there with the people. People with chainsaws, people with hand saws, and tractors, and various things. And kind of the catalyst that brought the collaborations that were happening in Southwest Oregon to kind of manifest itself to actual implementation were a synergy between Siskiyou Project, Lomacatsi, and the Forest Service in the Illinois Valley. It was personalities and relationships that were willing to step forward and challenge our own places in the community and our power base in the community, our social license, and challenge and stretch those things. And one of the key players in that I want to speak a little bit about was Joel King. And a lot of what we've talked about here is the turnover in the Forest Service and how that can be a barrier and a problem to some of these things. Joel King was a career Forest Service employee. He spent 30 years in the Siskiyou National Forest. He was a district ranger. He could have moved on and done all kinds of different things in the Forest Service, but he was a person of place as well. He raised his family there. He believed in what he was doing, and he stretched and pushed the Forest Service in the Illinois Valley and the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest to do these things. And so the Forest Service wasn't so much a barrier there as a major part of the catalyst that allowed us to pull this agreement together. He's since retired, but his legacy is carrying on through this work. Some of the accomplishments that we accomplished in our first year, 2009, of the 10-year agreement, we treated 1,300 acres. We had over $950,000 in salaries and wages. We trained 32 new local workers in the Illinois Valley, Cave Junction area, where unemployment is 25%. We had a 98-person workforce with 7 subcontractors in the valley working. We brought in $1.1 million from ARA funds to the valley, and we held, lots of community meetings and field trips, that sort of things. And a lot of this is outlined in our kind of annual report from our first year of work. And please help yourself. We've got some of those up here. Justin is also here with Lomacatsi, so if you have when you have questions, that he's here to help answer those questions. And I think I finished in less than 10. I have lots more I could say, but 2 minutes. What else should I say, Justin? You have anything you want to add? Okay. Well, we'll get to it in questions then. Thanks.
For Shane, you seem to have some hard statistics on your accomplishments, and I'm just, in the back of my mind as I listen to a lot of presentations, I'm wondering about the real public costs of these restoration collaboratives. What's the bottom line in terms of net public expense versus, what's the net public expense in terms of,
Actual dollars?
yeah, what's the balance sheet?
And can you repeat the question? Sorry, because
Sure. His question is related to the actual expense, the public, how much is the public paying for this? $1.1 million. ARRA funds came into Southwest Oregon to support our first year. So $1.1 million was the first paycheck, or the first bill to the public to restore federal land.
But what's the net cost? Because you talk about jobs created. You talk about jobs created, income to people, obviously generated from real dollars and real product. So what's the net cost to the public?
I don't know. I'm having a hard time figuring out how to answer that. Justin, can you answer it? I don't either. What do you mean the net cost?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not an economist.
I think
don't
what
know
he's saying is what you're reporting are the benefits, but is there a hidden cost here? Just like sort of, subsidies for timber sales, is there a hidden cost to collaboration where the federal government, we the taxpayers, are actually paying for this collaboration, and maybe we're not accounting for that against all these benefits that you're reporting? Is that the question?
Well, I think, like I said, I don't know. There was $1.1 million of federal tax dollars brought into the county to pay for this. Yeah.
Of the 1.1.
Hang on.
Of the 1.1 million, 951 went to on the ground. So the additional 1.1 is overhead, admin, collaboration, et cetera.
Okay.
So those are your hidden costs. Those are real dollars with collaboration included.
Did everybody hear that? Okay, great. Anne?
Also for Shane, I understand the benefits of 10-year agreements. Could you talk a little bit about any challenges associated with that?
Sure. I think the first year, the main challenges were that, and benefit at this, or windfall at the same time, was when we first signed this agreement, we didn't know that the ARRA Act was going to happen. And so we got all of this money, and we weren't really ready for it in the sense of, where are we going to do our first work? What are the projects? This money kind of came down, so we went to the shelf and grabbed, NEPA project, stuff that had already been NEPA to get shovel-ready work done. Justin?
As we move forward, timber bond.
Hey, Justin, can you just come up here so people can hear your responses? Thanks.
And maybe introduce himself.
Justin Columbine, co-director, Lomakatsi. And can you repeat the question again?
I was asking about the challenges of the 10-year agreement. So I heard you say bonding is a...
Right. The biggest challenge is, so the first about 1,300 acres is mostly fuels and biomass. The next 1,000 acres is heavy on the timber. And our biggest issue are timber bonding. So working within stewardship and collaboration, but yet meeting bonding requirements, being a small nonprofit. So I'd say that's the biggest issue right now.
We have Walter, Scott, Steve, and thank you.
I was interested in this conversation about the percentage of money going to the ground versus the total cost, which is an issue that I frequently am working with. But of those dollars that didn't go out to the field, I guess it would be interesting to me to know, were those costs that would have occurred even with a traditional planning and contracting process? You see what I'm saying? I mean, I'm frequently caught in this, well, what is your cost per acre for treatments of when you're funding, in my case, through federal grants to do collaborative restoration work? And people say, oh, that cost is too high. And it's like, compared to what? I mean, the agency would have spent that money in prepping the sale and doing all kinds of work that they would have done internally. So of that money that didn't go out to the field, I don't remember the exact number, how much of that would have been spent anyway in a more traditional planning environment? Because that's the comparison you really have to make, I think.
Yeah, there was, just looking at this, there was about 150,000 that didn't go on the ground. So that was spent doing these other components, working in the community collaboration. They help pay for that in this process. Will they have to do that with each project that we do? Not necessarily. This was an investment up front that brought a lot of the people together so that we can get on the same page and they know what we're doing, and it's transparent, and people can provide some input. And so there was that initial cost. We're not going to necessarily have to do that each time now, because we've built some trust and local community license, social license to carry on. Now, when we actually have some of these meetings and we open it up to the public, people aren't coming, and it's not because they don't trust us. It's because they do trust us. They've seen it, they know, they like it, they want it to continue. They're busy people, and they're going about doing their lives. And I think that's important. So, yeah, had it gone down, the normal path, some of that money probably would have been spent by the agency to do different planning processes and stuff. But I think that was an investment that they saw and Joel King saw that needed to be made in the community to make sure that the launching of this master agreement was done in an open and transparent way and built public trust. And so there was an investment in that.
Great. Scott?
That was loud. A quick comment first on these cost questions. I think that it's really hard to answer that without really broadening the scope of your analysis to include, like you said, what would have been spent anyway, how those dollars were utilized in the community, the indirect, et cetera, et cetera. And that would be interesting for us to kind of follow up on maybe another time. But my question, now that Justin's up there too, I'm sorry, you other guys, but back to Shane and Justin, is that cultural environment, like you mentioned, is as diverse as the biological environment there. And I think some of the other places, at least that I've worked, it's a little more monocultural on the people side. And I wonder if you guys have any insights as to how you approach collaboration in your sociocultural environment, as opposed to maybe, where I work in Bend or other places. Because it's quite diverse there, and it's quite unique, in my opinion.
Yeah, it is very diverse, and I think George McKinley's here as well, and he's done a lot of work in the area, bringing people to the table to talk about these issues and try to find common ground to move forward. But it's people, it's people dynamics, and it's complicated and it's challenging at times. But I think when we come to the table and we're honest with each other, people are willing to talk. And it's actually been quite pleasant. It's been a while since the timber wars. Some personalities and tempers have reduced, but in general, it hasn't been as difficult, I think, now as 10 years ago. No, it wouldn't have been able to happen. So Justin, do you have anything else to add to that?
I saw a lot of questions, so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so we've got
Hopefully that answers your questions. Scott.
we've got in the queue Steve Siebert, who's next. Ken, Martin, Steve, Kratville, and then Mo. So Steve Siebert.
A question for Jennifer. I was wondering if you could speak about how your group and the Heritage Act are managing or reconciling the historic land use of grazing with this growing problem of noxious weed invasions.
Yeah, that's a great question, because noxious weeds affect grazing, public and private land, reduce forage quality and quantity. Ranchers see it as a problem, and it actually has been sorry, it's a horrible pun, but fertile ground for us to explore, because it is the one component. We've met with a lot of people at their kitchen tables who are anti-wilderness, they're anti-government, some of them are pro-wilderness. Everybody's got their opinions and their practical considerations and then their ideologies. But the noxious weed component of our proposal has cut across that, and made it possible for us to sit down and talk about a common problem and look for solutions. And in a nutshell, the idea is that the Forest Service, as an agency, we were not prescriptive. We didn't say you shall spray, this amount of Tordon every year. But we did say you need to prioritize, strategize, and involve the public in a process for figuring out how to deal more effectively with noxious weeds. Because consistently, what we see is the agencies, it gets dropped down their list, and so we wanted to bump it up. and make it for this planning area where you have an existing, it's called the Rocky Mountain Front Weed Roundtable. You have a group. It doesn't take the Coalition to Protect the Rocky Mountain Front to do it. It's made of private landowners, nature conservancies, other NGOs, weed boards. There's a structure that exists to have a dialogue about how to fight noxious weeds, and we're just telling the Forest Service and the BLM to be good players. And then we're also looking through a different mechanism, ways to increase funding and resources as necessary. So it's been an issue that's brought even some county commissioners who are they're not high on wilderness. They're like, we like the noxious weed stuff. So in that sense, it's been super helpful.
Great, we have 5 questions in the queue. Ken's next, sorry. You're on there, Martin.
I'll see if I can bring some of Martin's ideas to the forefront. Ken Garkula, Washington Office, Forest Service, NEPA specialist. We've been hearing a lot about the collaborative process and some of the great things, but we haven't really heard how it affects maybe the NEPA process. And so my question to you, and too bad I didn't ask it maybe on some of the others, was what has the collaborative process brought to the NEPA process, and 2 or 3 key points that I would ask if you could address. Has it made things go quicker? Has it allowed, because you folks may be the ones that are putting the project together that the Forest Service is adopting and taking forward, are those now EAs because you've agreed that they're not non-significant? And have you moved into doing category exclusions or making use of category exclusions? And Sean, I believe, since I had to monitor all of the NEPA that was used in ARRA, I think you guys did have some category exclusions in your stuff. I don't want to swear to it. Okay.
The collaborative, the Josephine County Stewardship Group and the Knitting Circle have been participating in the NEPA process in Southern Oregon for quite a few years. And these first projects were part of already NEPA'd, they're already NEPA'd projects. It's the East Ivy Managed Stands EA and the Plantation Thin EA. And neither one of those EAs were protested, appealed, litigated by Siskiyou Project or KS Wild in Southern Oregon. So those, they were ready to go. We had already largely signed off on them by participating in the NEPA process through the collaboratives over the years that led up to that. So for these projects, no, there was no categorical exclusions. And I don't like categorical exclusions.
Martin.
My question is for Rick and Jennifer. One of the things I find so fascinating about both of the proposals is basically the codification of particular travel management decisions, not plans, but decisions or choices. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the perceived risks of not addressing travel management decisions, or the perceived risks of the status quo from a motorized recreation standpoint.
Well, I'm moving so slowly, I can just remember the last phrase already. The perceived risk of the status quo of
not. So basically, I mean, the two proposals are codifying travel management decisions, and it's one of the reasons I think folks find it so interesting and important. So when you're thinking about going that route of actually choosing legislation as a way to get a grip on motorized recreation, what are the perceived risks of the status quo of utilizing existing processes, travel management processes, or whatever?
Well, it's a delicate question because of the grudging respect I have from our non-traditional supporters on this proposal, but it doesn't really codify the existing travel allowances for motorized recreation. It reduces them, which is one reason I'm for it. But they also, I mean, it's not a secret. They know that it reduces them. It does get the common map, the places that they absolutely cannot afford to lose and still call themselves motorized recreationists. So to me, I guess to answer your question, you know, in plain language, it seems like a good deal for wild country. And I don't want to have to go back and fight that fight again. And it expands the wildness in the yak. Does that answer your question of why? And again, I want to reiterate, this is not, it's a very small proposal up on the Three Rivers District of the Kootenai National Forest. It's not codifying status quo of a travel management plan for the 2.25 million acre national forest. It's just a very small map of common ground where they can support never taking motorized vehicles into a pretty big chunk of country, and we will support, as long as they meet the winter needs of Wildlife Endangered Species Act, their continued usage in a few basins, but not all of the basins that they currently use.
Yeah, I have quibbled with you about the use of the word codification for our travel plan issue too, because I believe, one, it reduces, because it doesn't allow certain uses to occur into the new wilderness areas that we're designating, obviously. And it also it doesn't stop future planning for travel planning process. It doesn't bypass future NEPA travel planning. It puts sideboards on how that travel planning can occur. It says in plain language, there will be no expansion of motorized use from this point on, but it doesn't say there can't be a reduction either through formal travel planning or because of resource issues that might occur in the interim. So whether it's too much horse use or whether it's a motorized use that's causing problems and bleeding sediment into a stream, administratively, that could be halted through the NEPA process at any time into the future once the heritage proposal passes. So I don't think it's a codification of the travel plan. It's not cementing it in time and saying it never can be revisited.
So we've got 4 questions and 10 minutes. Steve Kratville.
My question is also for Rick and Jennifer. Assume if the wilderness designation occurs through the legislation, could you both speak to what the future relationships would be with the folks that you've worked with? Rick, in particular, you said it's a small piece of ground. So what are the relationships, and how would things progress beyond wilderness designation?
It's a funny question, and we ask ourselves that in our initial meetings so many years ago. Something I didn't say in my discussion. There were 2 things that our non-traditional supporters or allies were hammering us on in the beginning. When we said we wanted wilderness, they said, well, that's fine, you want your wilderness, we want to get rid of the Endangered Species Act and we want to get rid of NEPA. And it took 3 or 4 hard years for them to understand that couldn't happen. Out of those discussions, when you say, what do we see coming, we would tell them in those initial meetings, you're going to like this so much that this is just going to be the beginning. You're going to be wanting more of these kind of deals. You're going to be wanting more community proposals that have something attractive to everybody in non-controversial manners. And there would be some folks, way outside of our group who'd come in and say, don't have these collaborations, don't talk. It's going to end up all wilderness if you keep going to these meetings. And we said so. And if you support it and like it, what's wrong with with having more wilderness? And I think this is going to be successful, and I think it will be the beginning of the slow, insidious expansion of wilderness in Lincoln County, just like they feared. And it won't happen without them signing off on it, is why I'm joking about it. And I think we'll get there. We are detoxifying the word wilderness in northwest Montana, and that's huge. After 46 years of losing, we just... it's our experience that we just can't afford to keep losing wild country up there.
I think we've built lasting relationships up on the front with a variety of people in the community, some grudging and some wholehearted, we're friends now. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. The Badger 2 medicine is not a part of the heritage proposal in 2 significant ways. There's no wilderness or no conservation management area. It's a part of the noxious weed control work, but because the travel plan for the Badger is under litigation by motorized users, and because there's existing oil and gas uses in there, and because of its unique history as being sacred to the Blackfeet, there's still a lot of work there, and then there's continuing to be noxious weed work on the front for years and years to come.
Bethany? And I think it's coming from this side.
Thanks. I'm trying to figure out how exactly to ask this question, but Jen, there's 2 things that you said that struck me. One was that yours is the only collaborative that's been talked about that doesn't deal with trees or timber.
Oh, yeah.
And then second, you talked about how noxious weeds are continuously being dropped to the bottom of the radar screen. And so I'd like to kind of use that as the basis of a question to any of the three of you, or even for people to think about later, which is, do people think that if we were talking about watershed-based restoration instead of landscape-based restoration, that some of the types of activities that we would be engaging in would be different? There's an extensive focus on timber and forest management in almost all of the proposals that are being discussed today, and the other activities are subservient to those needs. And so I'm interested in how you think your proposal, your proposal is different because you said it's not high productive timber area, but for any of the other people up there, do you think that if you were looking at things from a watershed perspective, you would be emphasizing different priorities in the restoration approach that you're taking? And is that something we might talk about later when we talk about the budget structure and the contracting structure of the activities that are occurring in these restoration projects?
I think I'm going to pass it over, but just to clarify, there was never been a big threat or pressure, but our proposal does address timber harvesting within the non-wilderness part. I just want to make sure people can read about it. We can talk about it later, but it's not that we weren't silent on the issue of timber harvesting. It just wasn't a top priority. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's important to look at watersheds and to not just include the timber component. And the master stewardship agreement that we put together actually sets up the framework to do that. It's not just about, thinning plantations and pulling out trees. There's a whole series of activities that are covered there, from in-stream to roads. All of that's covered, and our hope is that by using retained receipts, we can take that money to do that other type of work as well. And we're engaged in one of the watersheds of the Illinois Valley. It's called Sucker Creek. It's where Oregon Caves is. We're doing some analysis there around the roads, the sedimentation to the salmon, and so we do want to expand the type of work that we're looking at and start taking those on, because they're as important as the plantations as well.
Just to clarify your response, would that work be dependent on the timber receipts from the other projects, or is it decoupled completely and would be funded through other means? Because I think that's a really key part of what I'm trying to get at, is that these other activities are almost always linked to the timber management component, and that makes them subservient.
Yes, some of it is. My hope is that we can also use, legacy roads and trails money and try to bring other budget items into this type of work and bring it under these MSAs, and it's not all just trading logs for restoration.
Mike Peterson. Yeah, Rick. Wait for the microphone, please.
Wait, Mary.
This for Rick.
I'm sorry. 1 second, Mike. Rick was going to respond to that too. I'm sorry. Hang on.
I'll be real quick so we can get to Mike. When you said that, Bethany, that the timber, I heard you saying that, I misheard you saying the timber part of these proposals, everything else is subservient to it. It reminded me of somebody coming up and saying, "You dance good for a fat boy." It's just kind of like but you're kind of right. In the media, timber is getting a lot of the press, but up on the Three Rivers Challenge, some of the receipts will come from very limited commercial timber, if any, if there's even a market by then. Robin, with the Headwaters Partnership, which you're much familiar with, has raised a couple million of non-timber receipts to do restoration up there. Watershed restoration is our dream for the Upper Yak, but we're not going to throw the timber babies out with the bathwater. We want to keep that infrastructure and culture if we can, but again, our track record is not good. Every time we try and help them, they go out of business. Mike's got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Yeah, it seems like Congress is reluctant, at least the Senate Energy Resource Committee is reluctant to legislate, permanent motorized vehicles in roadless areas like in the Three Rivers Challenge, or timber targets. And so I'm wondering how the Yak Valley Forest Council, as well as the rest of your group is responding to that recent release of the Senate committee's report, and if you're going to circle around and try and find a different way to reach agreements on wilderness, or how that's going to go.
I'm not, don't have too much heartburn about the committee releasing their draft with all of its placeholders. Our local agreements hold. We've established them. We believe in them and support them. I guess my question for the House and Senate committees on natural resources would be, if they're so concerned about a snowmobile in Davis Creek, then they better get up there and get it out. I think it's going to work out okay.
Okay, we have one more question, George.
Question for Jennifer. You described sort of the process and evolution of the Coalition for the Protect the Rocky Mountain Front, and it sounded like a pretty inclusive process over the years. A lot of different groups came in and out. Am I right in assuming that it's sort of been an open process to anybody who wanted to be part of that? And the second part of it is, there is some controversy about the proposal from folks who were involved over time, but just felt like the group wasn't meeting their needs, the conversation wasn't addressing their needs, and they left. And how did that work out? I mean, when you have people involved that didn't like where the group was going and they were sort of pushed out either of their own volition, values, or whatever, how does that work out?
Well, it's very loose-knit. It has always operated with open discussions at the coalition meetings that rotated around usually 3 or 4 different communities, everywhere from Browning down to Helena, to Great Falls, to Shoto. It's gone on for years, and it really, I don't know how to answer that question, George. I mean, people have always come and gone. They've always been welcome. There's been, like I said, it started, once we started to get to the nut of the heritage proposal, we did start with a concentric model of a small group of people trying to figure out a vision that worked, both on the ground and legislatively. And that sometimes those don't always completely line up. Finding the best lines topographically that would make sense from a management perspective to manage. Or one criteria I really have to mention is it was very important that our proposal, we've always called it kind of keep it the way it is. The idea was, how would this proposal, when drafted into legislation, how would it affect people's ability to make a living on the ground? So for an outfitter who maybe has a camp, who clears the trails using a chainsaw so that he can run his outfitting business, how would our proposal affect that individual? And I've said this before, there's always a balancing act between the national interest of it being public lands, and we've had people, Bill Cunningham, Gloria Flora, a variety of people well respected in their roles, saying, let's not forget this is national public land, and balancing that with a need to secure on a place-based method a proposal that protects the ecological integrity on the landscape level, no acre is left out, and secure, or at least not make it impossible for somebody to use the land in a way that they can continue to make a living. So we've always tried to balance that. And I don't know what to say of people who left. They're always welcome back. They've always been able to contact us, and we've held public discussions and committees and little groups, and we've always tried as hard as we can to be responsive. But it's not, it's a citizens initiative. I look back, I know I gotta stop. I look back at last night about, okay, how did the scapegoat become the first citizens de facto wilderness designated in the country in 1971? It was collaborative. It had every grassroots technique. It did not have Forest Service support. It did not have the support of every person. It took years to do, and it involved citizens. And there's no formula except that you should, in my opinion, be open, transparent, let people know, and we shouldn't bypass or circumvent public law to get there. that's how I feel about it.
Great, thanks. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. We are going to do report back from first from budgeting and contracting, and again, we're just going to lay out we're not going to go into the depth of discussions per se. We're going to lay out the top 5 challenges, opportunities, and the top 5 recommendations. We're then going to go to NEPA and planning, and then we're going to have the 2 groups from the legislation versus existing law report back to back, and then open it up for questions. And we're here for as long as you want to be on questions, but we're meant to end at 5 if we last that long. So, Justin.
Can you hear me? Okay. I got volunteered for talking in class, so. Our top 5 challenges in our group, starting with number 1, was a lack of flexibility of budgets, performance measures, using the term stovepiping. Number 2, cumbersome and obsolete contracting and agreement process, both from the agency, contractor perspective, grants and agreement revisions. Number 3, reauthorization of stewardship contracting authority. We felt that needed to be reauthorized. Little understanding of stewardship agreements, both within the agency and communities. And number 5, reauthorization of the Secure Rural Schools and PILT. Can you scroll down a little bit as I get going here? Our top 5 opportunities were IRR, CFLRP, providing guidance for restructured budgets. Number 2, training education on stewardship and CFLRP authorities, both internal and external. Number 3, creation of contractor cooperatives to deal with bonding. Number 4, reforming SRC and PILT to be performance-based. And 5, prioritize collaboratively developed projects focusing on quality versus quantity. Our top 5 recommendations were further reducing budgeting stovepipes by providing incentives tied to performance measures, promoting integrated accomplishments. Did I say that right? Yeah. Revise, simplify grants and agreements and contracting processes, including bonding, both economic and landscape scale. 3, permanent reauthorization of stewardship contracting authorities with some enlightened tweaks, I'm sure. 4, training education on stewardship and CFLRP authorities, internal and external. And number 5, reforming SRC and PILT to be performance-based.
And I didn't realize until we did the report out how many acronyms were in there, but I'm assuming that this knowledgeable crowd knows what those acronyms are. Any, what's that? Oh, really? Yeah. IRR is the Integrated Resource Restoration Proposal in the President's Budget. CFLRP is the Collaborative Landscape Restoration Program, Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. Wait a minute, SRC is Secure Rural Schools. Oh, I did that back, CRS, anyway. And PILT is a payment in lieu of taxes. I think I got all of them, didn't I? Okay. Questions? Yes.
How would you make PILT performance-based? It's payment in lieu of taxes. I'm a little confused.
Mark, you want to take a stab at that? Sure. You know what? Can I? Oh, it won't be recorded if we're not on the mic. Hold on. So the question was, how can you reform PILT to be performance-based? Payment in lieu of taxes. Mark?
This one. Is this one working?
No.
Nope. Now is it working? Yes. Secure Rural Schools is the first part of that, and the history of Secure Rural Schools is that payments to counties from the Forest Service were linked to commodity production, and they were decoupled by the Secure Rural Schools Act. And that opened a lot of work, a lot of room for counties in particular to participate with collaboratives on different tools. So stewardship contracting became an option because counties' payments were no longer linked to commodity receipts. The threat when that goes away is that counties will no longer want to participate in stewardship contracting. And one of our recommendations was reauthorize stewardship contracting authorities. And one of the challenges that was brought up is that a lot of county commissioners are not going to support that if secure rural schools is uncertain. So the idea is to link payments through the Secure Rural Schools Act, not back to commodities, and not maintain the decoupling, but actually link them to the ecosystem services or other values that are being created on public lands through all of the different tools that the Forest Service has in its toolkit. PILT interacts with Secure Rural Schools in a number of ways, but what we've heard from counties when we're out there, one of the keys to PILT is there's a population cap on your eligible payment, and that does not work for rural counties that are adjacent to metropolitan areas. So they get a tremendous amount of use on the forest, but they're not getting a payment that recognizes the use of the forest or the impact on local services. The other idea that's come up in PILT is that the formula starts with a base payment for the number of federal acres that are in your community, and then it subtracts from that revenue sharing payments that you get from other programs. But one of the ideas in PILT is to actually weight the federal acres somehow to preference protected areas in the county that would actually change the incentives through the PILT program for counties to actually want to have more protected lands in their community because they can't generate receipts. So there's no incentive to go to wilderness, but if you got a higher PILT payment for having more wilderness in your community, then you might be more amenable to some of the solutions that collaboratives are putting forward. So those are the ideas. Whether or not any of them are politically viable, we don't know.
Other questions? Okay. Alika, do you want to do the report back?
We'll deal with it. We'll deal with it. First of all, for anybody who thinks that NEPA and planning, that discussion was going to be a yawner, you were wrong because we had really, really good discussion. The other thing is I want to make sure that the group that was part of that discussion with me as a facilitator looks at this as a collaborative process because we didn't spend a whole bunch of time wordsmithing, okay? So we'll give you 5, don't worry, okay? The other thing that we didn't do is we assumed that the opportunities presented potential for recommendation, so we did not develop a separate recommendation category. So that ought to sort of compensate for it. Okay, so the top challenges, and this had to do with what the challenges and opportunities of the current NEPA and planning process are. And one of the challenges is that there's inadequate, clear, and clearly defined law, policy, or regulation that provide direction to collaborative efforts and how it fits with NEPA. There's too much expectation of collaborators that their work will influence the decision makers, and particularly as it applies to NEPA. So it's important that people understand where the decision space is and where it is not. The problem isn't just NEPA per se, but rather the case law and its cumulative constrictions often conflicting. And I think that's pretty apparent. You know, that not necessarily is the language of NEPA a problem, but it's all of the interpretation and everybody's interpretation in the court system and what that means in precedent setting that has been such an issue. There's an assumption on some people's part that NEPA at the large scale is quicker and cheaper, and that's not necessarily true at all. And then because I combined 2 and 3, that gives me 1 more. There are the business of different standards of NEPA between units and agencies. I think that's a real problem that we've all seen. The rules are fairly clear, but the interpretation of the rules, depending on whether you're with the Forest Service or the BLM, whether you're on District A or District B, Forest Z or Forest W, it varies. And that's really hard for people to work with because we're not consistent necessarily with how we interpret the rules and the standards. I am going to add this last one because there was a lot of discussion about it, and that is when collaboration is required through legislation. It could be that you guys touch on that when you do your presentation. We need a better understanding of where the agency responsibility and decision-making space starts and stops. So in other words, who's responsible for compliance? Opportunities, we need to find ways to align NEPA and groups, for example, collaborative groups, skills and expertise and resources. We all know that the Forest Service doesn't have all the resources that it needs to do everything, so how can we best complement what our collaborators, literally and figuratively, can offer up in the way of expertise and resources and skills? Forest Service needs to be more clear on defining decision-making space through the NEPA process. The bottom line is the agencies, and I say Forest Service, but it's any land management agency, has the accountability and responsibility, and their signature is on the line when it comes to decision. So that people need to understand that. Another opportunity is that CFLRA offers opportunity for innovation with a focus on big outcomes versus big NEPA, which ties back to one of the other ones. NEPA should help ensure that stakeholders are involved in project options to create ownership. I think that's a concept we all understand. I mean, if you get people involved up front, they're going to feel like they're part of the action. They're going to feel like their ideas are being considered, and that makes for a connection to the land that they care about. That makes for better decisions, ultimately. Clearly articulate the ground rules and expectations associated with sharing data and information, ideas, and protocols. In other words, we think that the standards and the expectations about whose data to use, and if we use your data, does that need to subscribe to the same protocols as her data and our data, and that's an opportunity that needs some work around. And then finally, we need to be focusing on partnering for more monitoring and follow-up. Results and effects are outside NEPA, but they certainly carry through to the next project. Any questions? Does anybody from the group want to add or clarify anything that I've shared?
Wow. It's getting to be the end of 2 days.
Yeah.
So I just have to say I love it, the way groups interpret the number 5, and then we wonder why we struggle with things like NEPA and budgets. So Karen is going to do one of the report outs, then we'll turn it over to Katie. And Kasha, do we need to load that one up? Okay, you want to come up here? And then we'll go into question and answer on this one.
Yeah, so kudos to Sonia, who formatted with color a mishmash that was up on the board. I was just taken aback when I saw how nice it looks.
That's an interpretation of the number 5.
Okay, so a couple things. One, we talked about, challenges and opportunities, or pros and cons, called them both things. And we did it both for the place-based legislation and for working within the existing framework of laws and regulations, et cetera. So challenges that came up, and there was a huge long list, and these were the top ones. Balkanization across the national forest system could set a negative precedent. May not, a new place-based law may not fit with or could circumvent an existing law. It could set up unrealistic expectations, and the example given was specific to the timber industry expecting a certain acreage or certain cut, and then that not being met. But it could, any obligations made through legislation and then they're not fulfilled, and so people become disenchanted with the process. Financial sustainability, and that was, over the long term. And may entail undesirable trade-offs. So then opportunities were financing, and I'm thinking part of this was in the context of whether there was outside funding for from foundations to support a place-based initiative, certainty and permanence in a variety of ways, mandating agency changes, heightening a public political debate so that a larger audience is part of the discussion, and put more chips on the table, meaning everybody with an interest in that landscape's kind of pulled into the discussion and puts their chips on the table so that you get some back and forth going on. Okay, before I move on, any other clarification the group wants to make? Okay, so let's go down to the next one. Okay, so this one was really interesting because, well, I'll save that comment till we get there. We had a couple different interpretations of the question. So starting with challenges, if you're operating within the existing framework, your challenges are because you're working with local capacity, so you're limited by that, or you're, well, you could be limited by that. You're, what the plan that's developed or the proposal is, or the agreement is driven by very local conditions. There's a lot of trust placed in the agency to follow through on the agreements. That we've talked before about changing personnel in key positions, the limitations of the budget structure, no funding guarantees, meaning you can come up with a great agreement and a great plan, but then how do you implement it? And I think there was also the discussion about it's difficult to fund the discussion itself. And existing laws may be outdated within which you're trying to develop new solutions. So opportunities, finer scale detail in decisions. So you're really getting into the nitty-gritty, consistent processes. Now, here's where we had a difference in interpretation, because one small group in the room interpreted working within existing laws to mean working with the existing NEPA, the existing National Forest Management Act, and existing regulations. And so there were some very, some of these comments like consistent processes, upholds and applies national policy and standards, and this, well, I'll put those two together. Those two were regarded as there was some fear around moving away from the status quo, and how do you deal with some changes that are less predictable at the local level? I hope I'm characterizing that correctly. Okay, and then so these other three dots, the first one and the last two, were more about when people develop agreements, MOUs, or the thing that Jim described this morning, the sustained yield. They're developing kind of new solutions within the existing framework. There's more flexibility, and you can have some adaptability. The current framework allows these MOUs and agreements. Okay, and then we moved to next steps. The group did not come up with recommendations, but with next steps. Thinking about what could happen after this symposium to move this discussion forward. One suggestion was to have some listening sessions, both congressional and administrative, to raise these issues up higher. Then there was some, the next one was to run some of these ideas that are generated here through some of the local efforts so that we get further feedback from the people who aren't in the room. And then this question of how do you maximize these opportunities identified, and how do you mitigate challenges? Is there some kind of guide that could be provided to local groups, or is it, that's the question. Could there be a guide about which strategy works in which conditions, and how do you maximize these opportunities, and how do you prevent falling into the challenges. There was some discussion that there would need to be more discussion amongst people like who are here before going to Congress, if there was an ask associated with it. But there's also discussion that it would be useful to have the feedback and have people brainstorming who are in Congress and in thinking about these things at a larger scale involved in that strategizing as well. And then the last thing we talked about was that definitions of words are critical, because we talked about the use of collaboration, what are some of the place-based, landscape, restoration, that lots of people hear different things when these words are used, and so it calls for a very challenging task of trying to define what those words are. Any other comments?
Okay, so we broke all the rules about numbers. But the good news is I have a little quick math way to fix it. But if you consider that there's opportunities and challenges for existing laws and opportunities and challenges for new legislation, and Karen's group did that really well, so that's 4 categories, right? So we get at least 20. We're not even gonna run through those with you. Because we did do those, we came up with a really great list. We did not prioritize them, and they are categorized a little bit. Kasha did that. The group didn't do that, but it was just too overwhelming to have this long list. So that's why we did it that way, and it may not be accurate or really reflect what the group said, but I think the actual bullets in the list do reflect what the group said really well, and there was a lot of really interesting ideas and good information. But we are going to just blow right through those. Again, a lot of them the other group came up with. This is good. We got some helpful stuff. See, look at all those opportunities. Have fun. Beer. We got beer on the list twice. So, as I said, we did some good work. But what we did come up with after those opportunities and challenges was a list of considerations of what to consider when you're going to, whether you want to do whether you want to do new legislation or work within existing laws. So what should you consider and think about? And then we also came up with a list of recommendations if you are going to do new legislation, things to think about. And then finally, we made a list of triggers, which is related to those two, but these are the reasons why you would consider doing new legislation as opposed to working within existing laws. So for considerations, we have areas and regions that are organized get the legislation. Something to think about, that they're the ones who get they're already organized, so they get more attention. It's like the squeaky wheel. Tools for success need to be available to all the different forests, which is almost the opposite of that, but something to think about. And then we talked about that we need to define what a pilot project is and how a pilot project is different from setting a precedent. The idea of a pilot project is actually to consider what you're doing and make changes before you set a precedent that you can't go back on or is very difficult to go back on. And my group, if I'm getting any of this off, please just jump in. We also think people should consider the challenges associated with changing environmental laws, or any laws really, and consider that collaboration can create a bureaucracy in and of itself, that you can codify collaborations, that the actual collaborations don't persist over time. Well, that's something to consider. And need to consider conflict resolution. Is that one of your goals? And if it is, have you set up a way to do conflict resolution? What is your method for conflict resolution? You need to consider focusing on the outcome you want, not the tool that you need to achieve that outcome. And what that person meant is, if what you've actually set out to do is restore your forest and revegetate roads, then think about how best to get there, and don't get sucked in by the idea of what tool to use first. And then consider national versus local interests, and consider place-based solutions can occur with or without new legislation. And that was a really important point that this group came up with. And that is related to this idea. When we did the challenges and opportunities, a number of people noted that a lot of the opportunities are the same for new legislation as they are within the existing laws. And that's partly what got us into the triggers conversation, because then the question is, well, why would you bother to try something riskier like new legislation? So for recommendations we had, if it's a pilot, it needs to have some sunset before long-term authorization. And when possible, focus on administrative tools to obtain your objectives. Work with power brokers early and often. That's just a general recommendation, good idea all the time. And then if people are going to sit at a table and create new legislation, okay, so the idea here, it was a little confusing, but if you're going to create new legislation, basically sit with different interest groups and find out, in a way, what their interests are and what their bottom line is. And those are two really different things before you go forward with developing that legislation. Because once you know what people's interests are, then you and what the bottom line is, you have more flexibility to actually work out a solution that's going to work for the most number of people. But if you don't know what people's bottom line are and you create something that's going to trash their bottom line, you're going to get a lot of pushback. That was, I think, the idea there. Then we recommend that you honor and understand existing laws before trying to change them, with a big emphasis on the understand, and then create some opportunities for an experimental framework. And someone mentioned there's an idea of a Region 7, but just if things really aren't working before setting a national law that applies everywhere, maybe create a pilot of some sort. And then work to make implementation of existing laws better as part of what you're doing. And then it's an important recommendation to, and this was came in late, so not everyone in the group heard it, but distinguish between interests and values. Can help a lot with the conflict. And then here are the triggers that we came up with of why you would try new legislation. One, if your need is outside existing legislation, that's fairly obvious. Whether or not the rest of the nation likes it. You can get additional appropriations. So you might go for legislation because you can actually, even though it would work within existing laws to do what you want to do, you can bring extra resources through legislation that you couldn't otherwise. It can create more certainty. There's the obvious one, you're working within the existing Wilderness Act, but you do have to create new legislation if you want to designate wilderness for a specific place, or other special land designations. Also, if the land management, different than the designation, requires new or clearer direction, that might trigger a legislation. If you want to offer solutions to systemic problems, which came up as big challenges throughout the course of these 2 days. If you want to do something outside of existing authorities, or if you've exhausted administrative remedies, and we talked about different people have different definitions of what exhausted means, but if they're not working, you might want to jump into legislation. And then also this idea that there's a chance to elevate ideas or concerns that you might be able to elevate through existing laws, but you've tried really hard and it's not happening. They're not getting elevated. So you start with new legislation, and then the outcome may be new legislation, or it may just be that you're getting attention or some sort of change, which is what you were looking for. Or there may be a concern that's really unique to your place, and by pushing for legislation, you're bringing attention to it that you wouldn't get otherwise. So that's ours. Does the group have anything to add? Great.
So I realize that was two fairly lengthy report backs together, but questions? Holy cow, we got a tired group. Okay. I think I think what we're going to definitely try, well, I think what we're going to definitely try and do, we are definitely going to post on the website all of the tables that were developed yesterday. And we will post the information from the breakout groups today on that same website. And I think it'll go both on National Forest Foundation website and the Boley Center's website. I think, honestly, we're still struggling with how to develop a synthesis report and whether or not that would be useful. So I think there's some discussions that'll happen between NFF and Martin and the Boley Center, and we'd love your feedback on what you think might be useful out of what came out of these 2 days. Send an email, call, whatever. Yes, Scott. Yes, if you want to be recorded.
Some of this output of all this workshopping that we're being done is going to be packaged up, and I mean, it's going to be on the website, but is it going to somebody to be used for? No.
No, unless Martin, do you want to add to that at all?
Have it follow up.
No, you don't have to.
That's complicated. Well, if I wrote, my concern is if I wrote a report.
There'd be so much listing. I don't know how much more analysis I can do. But I'm also doing a cost share with the Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain region, trying to look at, and that's what I put these tables together for, actually, looking at all of these selected place-based bills and agreements and trying to make some sense out of it all. And so my task for the Forest Service was to define those characteristics that are shared by these groups, to do some pros and cons, some analysis, and then to provide the agency some recommendations in how it can react in a constructive fashion. So I'm going to do that report for the agency, and I'm thinking that I'm obviously going to use a lot of this material for that project. So a lot of value added, I suppose.
So I have a follow-up. Sorry.
You're not really sorry, Scott.
Well, I'm sorry about waiting for the mic.
Uh-huh.
I know that there's a lot of collaborative groups, others watching collaborative groups, et cetera, that are wrestling with a lot of the issues that have been questions at this workshop conference. And, I came with some specific questions that I knew wouldn't get definitive answers, and I was right. But I wanted to, what's the best way to keep some of these conversations going? Is it through the, what is it called, the Collaborative Assistance Program? I'm sorry, is that?
You're probably
WestCan.
referring to the Western, yes.
Collaborative Assistance Network, that's
Yes,
it.
Thank you.
How is that a good way for me? Because I've got some broader, deeper questions that I want to keep working on. And it's a lot easier with a big group of people who are all thinking about it than on my own in my office in Bend.
So I guess I'd like Martin and Karen to respond to that.
Shameless self-promotion. We have Sharon Friedman of the Forest Service and myself have this blog, A New Century of Forest Planning, and I put a lot of material, I cross-posted a lot of the materials on that website, and that it would be wonderful to have this group participate in that discussion. I mean, it's a pretty sophisticated cast of contributors and discussants, and it would be absolutely wonderful to have a group like this participate. We have our own category for place-based legislation, and maybe that would be one outlet.
What's it called again?
New Century of Forest Planning.
So speaking.
I don't think your mic's on, Karen. Maybe it was on.
I'll just switch. For the Western Collaboration Assistance Network, one thing we've been doing is hour-and-a-half-long peer learning sessions, and we're always looking for topics and people who want to talk about things. So anybody can tap into them through the phone, and we've been doing web conferencing where people can throw up a couple slides or we can look at a website. But they're really meant to be open roundtables, so I would love it to get some specific ideas from folks. If you want to send me an email, and we can, also look at what came out of the session and just try to schedule something so that. And I would hope that you would all sign up and participate.
Great. Other sort of closing questions? Bethany? Run, someone.
Thanks. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to elaborate on something I said in the last session. I think that almost everything that was focused on at this session was focused on timber, and there are watershed-based collaboratives who are working on national forests, on watersheds, and on watershed management, and using a lot of the same tools and struggling with a lot of the same questions. And I'm really interested in how you can expand this discussion to incorporate those watershed-based questions and watershed-based issues. And I'm particularly concerned because as the agency is moving forward with restoration, if our community, like the agency, focuses almost exclusively on the timber management issues of restoration, then I think that we are contributing to that as the highest end-all be-all of how we're going to restore our national forests. And so I think that was really missing from this discussion, and if there's going to be follow-up, I would really encourage National Forest Foundation, Boley Center for People and the Environment, and other participants to look at how to incorporate in those watershed groups and the watershed-based questions that aren't so focused on trees.
Great. Thanks, Bethany. We will certainly consider that. Anyone else? Martin, before I do some closing comments, do you have any wrap-up that you want to do? Nope? Okay. So I want to say probably just 4 quick things. First and foremost, I want to thank all of you for your time and energy and your brain trust. You've been an awesome group to work with, and I know you can tell by both the energy level in the room and the number of people who are gone, this was a pretty draining process. So especially for those who stayed behind, thank you. I also want to thank Ford and Wilberforce and the Forest Service for supporting this effort. If that didn't happen, we wouldn't be able to be here today, and I think this, and yesterday, and this was a great start of what people have felt was a much needed discussion. And I also want to say thanks to our facilitators and the support team, because without them, we wouldn't have been able to pull this off. And then last but not least, we would love your evaluation, because we're always trying to improve what we do when the forms are on the outside. You can just leave them on a table out there. And Karen reminded me we recycle name tags if you want to leave them behind when you go. Thank you all very much.